Light Pollution News 2025, One Lux. This episode you won't want to miss. A bridge actually turns its lights off for birds. You heard that right. A bridge turned its lights off for birds. And there's more evidence for how our endless daytime affects plants. And can artificial light at night influence puberty's onset? With me this episode are returning guests, jack of all trades, Mr. John Barentine, author and journalist Lynne Peeples, and bird lover aficionado Tatsiana Thomson from Brome. Here we go, folks. It's a good one. Let's do this. Welcome to Light Pollution News. I'm your host, Bill McKinney. Very glad that you at home could join me today. I want to welcome any first-time listeners out there. We do this show twice a month and look at all of the news around our disappearing night. If you are curious about anything said today, just jump on over to our website, lightpollutionnews.com. You'll find a summary, a walkthrough, including all of the links that we talk about in today's episode. I want to also remind you that we are a listener-supported show, and you guys really do help us keep this thing afloat. If you like what you're listening to today, why not consider supporting the show? You can learn all about it simply by clicking the support the show link in the show notes of whatever podcast player you're listening from, or simply by going over to lightpollutionnews.com and clicking the support the show link. And finally, you can always reach out to us with questions, thoughts, ideas, and much more. I'm Bill at lightpollutionnews.com, or you can find any one of our social media assets out there, including on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, and many more. Glad to have you here with us today. Why don't we get started? Let's get the show on the road. I want to welcome back to the show Mr. John Barentine. John is an astronomer, historian, author, science communicator, dark sky consultant, here in a PhD in astronomy from the University of Texas, and is a member of the American Astronomical Society, the International Astronomical Union. John also runs Dark Sky Consulting, LLC. John, welcome back. It's always good to see you. You have events like the Artificial Light at Night Conference. It's taking place in Ireland right around the recording of this podcast. How have you seen that grow over the past few years or past few times? I know it's a periodic, it's not an annual thing.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me back on the show. This is always a wonderful experience. So I'm glad to be here. This is the 9th edition of this conference that was first held in 2013. And the attendance is growing every time. And we're seeing people coming in from new disciplines, from new countries. The research is gradually making its way into the public consciousness, although there's just a big problem with public awareness, especially right now there's so much going on in the world and so many topics that are vying for people's attention. I think what has really benefited us in that respect is that there are some good science journalists out there who've been very helpful in not only raising the attention to these issues, but then helping to really explain the studies well so that people can understand them. If there's no understanding, they can't take something away from that they might then use when they're making decisions about lighting. So it's good for us to do more of that communication work and talk to some of these really great journalists that are helping to get the word out.
Has the conference itself, do you feel like it's producing a greater volume of higher quality research, or is the research quality improved over time? What are your thoughts on how effective it's been on the literature side?
I think it's been most effective in helping people make connections that they might not otherwise make. There are lots of discussions that take place on the sidelines of events like this that in some cases later turn into studies of their own. People realize that they have connections with people that maybe they don't know very well, and they have common research interests, and they'll get together after the conference, and then that will lead to the studies being produced. So that it's a sort of an incubator where people can get together and talk about these issues with like-minded people, and we've seen some really great collaborations come out of that.
My second guest today is Tatsiana Thomson. Hey, Tatsiana, you are up there in Canada, in Quebec, one of my favorite provinces. We actually go up to Quebec often to go skate in the woods up there out by Gatineau, which is that's a fun one. It's a cool province. I really love Quebec.
Well, you have to come here. Do you know Louis Penny? They're right. No, Three Pines. This is right here in Knowlton. So you have to come to here. You got Three Pines in Knowlton, and you got Squirrel Buster in Knowlton, and you got 4 ski mountains here. So if you're into skiing and mountain biking, you have to come visit us.
Sounds great. Yeah, it sounds good. Well, you're up there working for Brome, the bird feeder company that finds a peaceful way of mediating squirrel disputes when it comes to bird feeders. I'm curious, when did your love of birds begin? Where did it start?
When I moved here, I grew up in the city in Eastern Europe, so birds were not really anywhere on my radar. And then moving to the countryside, and a beautiful countryside, and then the owner of the company happens to be my husband's family's friend. So that kind of all, once you notice birds, you can't unnotice them, right? So they become part of your life, and the passion just grows. And it's such a wonderful hobby that you can take anywhere. So it all became, a passion and turned into a job. But I'm very grateful to have such a wonderful combination of the two.
And since we're talking about artificial lights, one of the things that we noticed the other day, the woodcocks are starting to pass through, and got in a car and we saw a woodcock underneath an area of dirt waterway area that was lit. It was lit, and the woodcock, I'm sure, was using the light because it could take it to its advantage to keep going out there and hunting, even though the sun had been down at that point, and technically it was, nighttime. So that's just a little observation. You can see how artificial light changes the character of the creatures that live in it, which we'll get to in a little bit. But first, something that I was waiting for, I picked up this really great book called Inner Clock, Living in Sync with Our Circadian Rhythms. I'm looking forward to reading it. I really apologize, I have not read it. But Lynne Peeples, you're here. And tell me about this book. Where did this book come from?
Hi, well, I'm very happy to be here. Thanks so much again for having me on the show. The book, I think I'd say it's been marinating probably my entire life. I grew up in Seattle, and I always had sleep problems, particularly in the wintertime when you get very little light during the day. Day gets really short. And there were times like in high school where you'd go to school in the dark, and you'd come home in the dark and you'd not really see the light of day. But it was really only a few years ago when I moved back to Seattle from living out on the East Coast. And I've been a lifelong Seattle Mariners fan, which is really fun right now. I'm curious when this airs.
Hopefully by the time this airs,
yes,
they would have won the World Series. But
absolutely. Yeah. So I had gotten an invite to go to what was then Safeco Field, now T-Mobile, to see an installation of new artificial lights. So LED lights, they had just upgraded the whole lighting system. But it wasn't just the field. They had also upgraded the lighting system in the locker room. And so, we saw all the bells and whistles on the field, fun, flashy lights, went into the locker room, and they started talking about this circadian lighting system that they just installed to help energize the players before the games. They would turn on, brighter bluer light. And then after games, they would dim the light, make it a warmer color to help the players calm down and sleep.
Now, do they dim it always for the visiting team? Is that?
I don't think the visiting team walk group gets it. So we have our advantage, right? Yeah. So I was fascinated. That is the first time I really thought about circadian rhythms beyond just, well, I've had sleep problems my whole life, right? So that led me down many rabbit holes over the years since then.
Yeah. Well, I'm looking forward to the book, and hopefully you can help us with some of the articles we got today. So how about we jump into it? And last episode, we kind of only covered about half of the articles. I'm just going to skip over a warm up and jump right into the show. There's a little chunk of news that occurred this past fall. Something called Earth Night took place on September 19th. Earth Night, not to be confused with Earth Hour, derived from a 2020 campaign by the nonprofit Godparents of the Night. Much like Earth Hour, it relies on the voluntary buy-in of participating municipalities, businesses, and residences, and Earth Night is largely a German activity right now. So it's interesting that a additional group that you have people kind of trying to add in, I guess, to say, I know Earth Hour isn't specifically for recognizing artificial light and light's impact, but it was kind of part of it, right? John, do you know of any other group out there that does something like this?
I don't think I know of any that is organized on a large scale. I think these are events like this are kind of a complement to things like the Dark Sky festivals that we're seeing increasingly very locally in different parts of the world, that I think speaks to the appeal of the subject more generally. It's bringing in people that aren't normally part of this coalition, as it were, in the advocacy world, because they see, what's this about? They want to know more. Be great if it catches on. And we certainly have enough light festivals in the world, so why not more of these activities that are focused on darkness?
Preach. I hear it. Well, there's some good news from down in Lone Star state of Texas. Back in November of 2024, the Austin City Council charged the Watershed Protection Department with developing recommendations and guidelines for creating a bird-friendly building code for new construction. In the same resolution, Austin endorsed the implementation of a Lights Out campaign for the city. While the department reported back and it's received full endorsement of Austin's Environmental Commission, the commission, I should note, built a working group of diversified stakeholders, including conservationists and developers, and a recommendations which include a full implementation of dark sky compliant lighting standards, also require bird-safe building design materials for the first 100 feet of a facade with what's being called a material threat factor rating of 20 or less. For you at home who's never heard of the material threat factor, it's a scale built by the American Bird Conservancy to measure how dangerous a building is to birds. It ranges from 0 to 100, and currently in New York City, new builds are required to have a threat factor of 25 or less for 90% of the first 75 feet of construction. This is an interesting piece, the fact that you are seeing communities actually think about birds in their architecture. Tatsiana, have you seen any areas out there that kind of exemplify good building codes, be it in Canada or wherever you've been?
I think it's all depends on municipalities. I do know we've run a couple of articles before here in Canada that any new builds are required to have bird-friendly glass windows. So basically, no more of that reflecting. There's a very specific rule of having, dotted glass, like it's actually inbuilt so that it doesn't reflect the environment back. So yes, it is starting to become a common practice in some municipalities, but there is still a lot of law that needs to be implemented to make sure that it becomes a law, not just, this municipality deciding to implement it or not.
Have you ever talked with anyone in policy about any of these bird-safe building codes?
I have not personally, no.
Yeah, the reason I ask is I feel like many places are kind of incredulous to it. I know there's a community in California, I can't recall the name of which one it was. We had it discussed about a year ago on the show that decided that, having bird-safe lighting and bird-safe building codes were too much. And they thought, we don't need to do this. The birds will figure it out on their own. I don't know. What's the alternative here? The birds that died, they collided with the building. Would it be better just to leave them on the sidewalk so people actually recognize the impact? I say this somewhat facetiously, but at the same time, I feel like you never see the impact. It's just something you hear about, right?
It happens mostly in big cities. So a lot of people I find that live maybe in rural areas or, less populated think, oh, this is just a big city problem. It's not my problem. Whereas, it doesn't matter where you live. I still have birds that collide with my glass, even though I draw all sorts of things and, but it just happens. I don't have that specific glass, it's not possible to find it even available to, to your regular consumers. It's, you have to order it and go out of your way if you want to install something like this. It's still not very affordable.
Well, that's sad to hear. Well, in other news on the bird front, fall is one of my favorite times of year. I love, college football, changing color of leaves, getting a reasonable hour for stargazing. It's nice to be able to do that before 10 o'clock at night, but also earlier nights comes with an increased risk of collisions with owls. And Tatsiana, I think you mentioned this on our first show this month. Per the British Columbia SPCA, owl injuries increase in autumn as many owls hunt near roadsides in low lighting. So be on the lookout, folks. And for the first time in my tenure of doing the show, here's some additional news out there that actually is, I guess this is a really great piece, even though it's only 2 days. It looks like a city switched their obnoxious decorative bridge lighting off. I can't recall ever reading a story where a city switched bridge lighting off ever for anything. But they did during bird migration. The city of Burlington, Iowa, population 23,000, turned off the non-essential lights on a Great River Bridge that spans across the Mississippi River. The switch off, which amounted to turning off some excess uplighting, occurred for 2 days on September 26th and September 27th. And it was spurred by bird migration projections from Purdue University and the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. Bridge lighting is notoriously difficult to gain any type of compliance on with regards to ecological lighting issues. So 2 days is no small feat. we have these lights out campaigns, and I see on social media, it feels like mixed messaging. You have people out there in positions of, I guess, respectability is probably the best way to put it, say like a meteorologist or someone who has some kind of public notoriety, and they say, hey, we got a big bird migration night, make sure all your lights are out. I've always read lights out to be for non-essential lights, essentially. Like if you have, say, a garage light that's shielded and it's, you feel comfortable, you just want to have the light there, that's not the end of the world. You're angling it at the right point. You're taking care of the light management on it. Am I incorrect in thinking that? Should it be all lights?
Yes, it is better not to have any lights, right? So you're not disturbing, and they do get confused, right, by any kind of light. So if you happen to live somewhere where the birds are really migrating, because there are certain routes that birds take. So I guess it also depends where you live. Some areas are more densely flown over than the others. But I think for your own peace of mind, I just turn everything off so that way I don't have to worry about finding birds in the morning or predators as well, are out and about, raccoons, go for birds. So I just feel better not having the lights outside.
I have the same kind of feeling about this. I think there is some social value to lights out programs. And I think there's some demonstrated instances where it really does make a difference. Speaking of the Cornell Ornithology Lab, which has done work as an example with the tribute in light on the anniversary of September 11th, where they aim these massive floodlight beams up into the night sky over Manhattan to evoke the images of the missing Twin Towers. And they've been working with the ornithologists now for years to turn those lights off periodically during the display, because otherwise they attract birds from miles around and they get stuck. They just orbit these beams of light. They turn the lights off for 15, 20 minutes at a time. It lets the birds escape. We talked in the previous episode about the drone displays, and I made a comment that, people like these kinds of displays of light, and they're not going to give them up easier. So where's the balance? How do we strike the balance here? I'm a little concerned that while the lights out has this potential social benefit, and it might have a benefit for the birds, that it sort of avoids dealing with the real problem, right? It's a sense that there's a big switch we can go over and we can turn that off for a while, and that absolves us from the responsibility for all those other lights. They may be low level, but they're on every night, all night long. And it strikes me a little bit like trying to have it both ways. And that then in turn makes me think about things like greenwashing. Are we leading the public to think that the problem is really taken care of if we turn off the lights for a couple of hours during migratory bird season, for a few nights, and everything is fine? Not to say that we should get rid of these programs, but let's try to move it on to the next level, right? Once we have the public on board with the idea of turning lights off for birds, now let's get them to think about, well, what about the other lights that are on every night? What about the other species that are being impacted by this? It should be a component of an overall system of messaging rather than putting all the emphasis just on these programs themselves.
I think that's a really good point. I just wanted to add, how much can we also add to the conversation, the impact on human health? We're one of those species too that are getting impacted. And I wonder, as we do more of these, kind of social experiments, will people experience for themselves, turning out these lights is not really making me feel unsafe, or I can still see. Maybe they'll experience for themselves that. And then also if we can, increase education out there, information campaign about all the benefits for our own health, which are subtle. It's sort of like we were talking about earlier about the birds that are swept away, at the night that got killed so we don't see them. The impacts to our health are also hidden largely. It's very subtle, the impacts to our circadian rhythms from not getting that light during the day and not getting that darkness at night. So I think, greater awareness about that and perhaps experiencing some of these differences for ourselves could be helpful.
The Lights Out program here started for the main towers, right? For your downtown towers, and is trying to limit the light put out from some of these tall towers. When it translates into a local homeowner, though, that's where I think I get a little nervous, because maybe we should be, instead of talking about lights out for local homeowner, talking about responsible lighting practices. To your point, Tatsiana, don't light up your stupid tree. Don't do that. Don't go and leave a floodlight on all night that hits your neighbor's the side of your neighbor's house. I feel like that would be more impactful than, say, telling everyone to turn lights off. My worry is that when we do that, you create a backlash of people who say, you're telling me what to do. And just, this is hogwash. And you see it all the time in other areas. And that feels very threatening, I think, when you tell people lights out.
Exactly. Try to appeal people to take care of themselves and be neighborly, just starting there, it's hard to save the world and think of all the problems out there. But, it's a lot easier to change it when you think of yourself, what's good, what's beneficial for you. Yes, lights are not beneficial for us. And then for your neighbors, but you can't if you're shining a light into their bedroom window.
And like you were talking about earlier, focusing, or maybe this was last episode, thinking about what are the impacts to your own pocketbook or the economic impacts. So turning the lights off, you're going to save money. Turning the lights off, you could be sleeping better and be healthier. Yeah. So really focusing on that, our selfish intentions.
It's just marketing, it's very, very simple marketing because, people understand and can connect better when it starts with themselves, right? When you can sort yourself out, then you start looking at how to improve things in the next level. And then it goes on and on until you hit that transcend, the top of the pyramid, basically, right? When you're ready to take on the world and help everyone else.
That's why we have a marketing manager here today. That's exactly. Since we're on the topic of lights out, for any of you in New York-based listeners, you may be interested in learning that both the city and the state need your help in pushing through some legislation should you be so inclined. First, on the city front, 0896-2024 is currently stagnating with the New York City Council. This bill requires office buildings and stores to keep non-essential exterior lights off from sunset to sunrise, with exceptions including for small businesses, for when offices are being actively utilized, landmark buildings, Times Square, of course, and store window displays. Of course, there's exceptions for holidays. Second, the Dark Skies Protection Act A4615, which is currently with the Senate Committee on Environmental Conservation. This act would require, among other things, a shielding clause designating only downward lit fixtures for all buildings, regardless of zoning type. If the lights don't meet the standard, the law would require them to be turned off between 11 through to sunrise. It also has a recreational clause citing that sports activities and amphitheaters can't be lit past 11 p.m. It goes without saying that there's a long list of exceptions and exclusions to the law. This one was submitted this year. Do you have any thoughts on some of this legislation?
I've been watching both of these bills. The one in the state assembly has been in development for years. It has been introduced and reintroduced in different forms. It's good that people want to do something about this, right? Both of the pieces of legislation are a good start. I don't think they go far enough. The main difference, I think, particularly in both of these instances, it differentiates them from some legislation in other parts of the country, is that the intent is to apply to situations that are not just state-owned property or city-owned property. That in principle, if they were implemented correctly, that there would be real-world consequences for private property owners instead. And we need to do more than just state-owned or publicly owned outdoor lighting if we want to have an effect on decreasing light pollution. But they have varying degrees of support from both politicians and the public. And those are the pieces of the equation that you've got to have in order to get them across the finish line. And of course, I have a lot of concerns about, even really well-crafted pieces of legislation that gain the support of the politicians, especially if they're not well known by the public or they don't have a wide amount of support, that you will run into problems in the enforcement phase. And you can have the best crafted piece of legislation that is simply not enforced and ultimately has no effect.
Is there a good way to go about I guess going to ask a question here. Anyone can jump in. In Pennsylvania, the PA Dark Skies tried to submit a bill, and the Senate committee was like, I don't know about this. But my thought on the bill is it's a nice way to start, but it doesn't address the populist piece. So you can put through legislation, you can put through a law, you can try and get legislators and do whatever. And I always feel like there's a bit of cronyism when you don't have popular support pushing through that law. When it's going through the cycle of the system and it gets passed and it gets passed with something else, and most people weren't really in support of that, and it doesn't mean that they weren't in support of it. It just doesn't mean that they were aware or they weren't informed or they didn't understand it as much. And I guess, is there a way that groups, if they're interested in this, should be messaging, working with the public, building support for that? Do they have to go out and, because these are typically very small groups?
Bill, I feel like there's not enough work done in the lead up to the legislation. It's really grassroots. In too many cases, I think they proceed to try to push the legislation before the time is ripe, as it were. And then we have these issues with implementation and enforcement, largely because everybody just ignores the rule on the other side of it. But that work can also take years and years, even in small jurisdictions, to get enough of the public on board. I always advise people that, if you want to build that coalition, you've got to give people a reason to buy in. They have to see themselves in this. They can't see this as of interest only to environmentalists or only to people who care about birds or only to people who care about the night sky. That they've got to see dollars and cents issues in it, which I think is a great thing to pick up on. They need to see their health and well-being in it. They need to see amenity in their communities. They need to see that it benefits them, that the place they live will be better off if they do this. And in many cases, they don't. And they proceed to, as you say, through a sense of cronyism. It's not hard to enact legislation. It really isn't. But it's very difficult in many cases to make it work in the implementation phase. And that's where things usually fall apart. So it just takes a lot of that sense of coalition building, the community support, and the prep work for that just takes a lot of time and effort.
A study that came out that was looking at how people view two different types of seabirds. I think this is kind of along the same frame that we're talking here. Those being the beloved puffins and a lackluster storm petrels. The study looked at how to frame the conversation efforts when one of the subjects isn't really beloved and one maybe even scorned. They found that in order to promote responsible policies, individuals had to connect on an emotional level with these birds, which has been a challenge for the storm petrel. Light pollution causes upwards of thousands of shorebirds to strand on shore annually. This stranding often starts at birth, whereby fledglings are drawn to the artificial lights, which act as a trap, disorienting the birds to its detriment and possibly demise. Before we jump off of this study, I found it interesting. Researchers generally lumped people's perceptions of wildlife into two camps: traditionalist, or someone who wishes to maximize human utility of wildlife, predictably fostered the most negative association for these storm petrels, and the mutualist, whom believed in successful coexistence between wildlife and humans. Again, this is kind of like the framing that we were talking there before, John. Tatsiana, have you had any experience trying to talk to the public about some, in this case, birds that are not as, they're not the fan favorites?
Yeah, I just actually had a little episode published last week. It's called R for Red-winged Blackbird. I don't know if you guys know this bird. Not the most exciting bird, not the most interesting looking. Everyone loves them in the spring here when they arrive, right? It's in March when we're all sick and tired of snow. So when the birds arrive, we know that's it, spring is on its way. But unfortunately, they bring, all their friends and extended family with them. So your feeders are covered in red-winged blackbirds. So in 5 minutes, your feeders, all your expensive seed is gone, right? So it's okay at the beginning, okay, they migrated, they're exhausted, let's help them out. But, when July comes and August, and it's all you're seeing at your bird feeders sometimes, and, they're chasing all the other birds away. Everyone's sick and tired of them. But at the same time, people don't realize that they are part of our ecosystem, right? And they are what helps us control all the pests. Right. I have an organic garden, so I see all these birds go and pick up all the bugs. We don't use any chemicals. So I welcome the birds. And even though I feed them and I continue feeding them, I know that a lot of people don't want to deal with them. It's easier to spray your plants with some chemical and be done with that. But that's the kind of bird, whether you love it or hate it, they're still part of our ecosystem and we need them no matter what.
Yeah, I like red-winged blackbirds. I think they're great birds.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, a lot of people get frustrated with them, and I totally understand because, you're paying for an expensive feed or expensive seed to see cardinals and rose-breasted grosbeaks, and all you get is red-winged blackbirds.
Oh, it's better than
Or
squirrels.
grackle.
It's better than squirrels, right? From the journal Mammal Research, a team asked what type of light works best for identifying tropical nocturnal mammals. They looked at white LED headlamps, red LED headlamps, and thermal imaging devices that utilize an additional red light. The answer, perhaps unsurprisingly, was the use of the thermal imaging with red light. White scored the worst, for which the team failed to see 10 species when utilizing. However, the red light scored pretty good, to which researchers surmised that the animals didn't register the red wavelengths. Thereby, they weren't disrupted in the same manner as a white light. And red light had the added bonus of illuminating animals' eyes to brighter levels from a greater distance. So if you want to be scared, as we record this around Halloween, take out your red light and go into the woods and see what happens. And lastly, on the ecology front tonight, let's take a look at plants. I have an interesting study from BMC Plant Biology that looked at plane trees in China. For you at home wondering what a plane tree is, it's actually a type of tree, a plane tree, spelled like an airplane, Plane, same family as our American sycamores. And apparently the plane tree is a common urban tree. Researchers wanted to learn more about how artificial street light affected the leaf structure, so they sampled the normal yellowing leaves, which occurred away from streetlights. Green leaves held onto the trees under streetlights, and any green leaves found away from streetlights, for which, in regards to the latter, there apparently wasn't an abundance of. What they found was that the urban leaves ended up suppressing hormones related to aging and had a greater activation of anti-aging auxin and cytokinin genes. This was the opposite for the naturally yellowing leaves. The team surmised that keeping leaves green in a winter could create frost-related damage for such trees. So, it looks like there's a growing body of looking at how plants are affected by light. This one, I think, John, you might know these guys here. This comes from Nature Cities, which they use satellite analysis to review data for 428 cities around the world. Look to see how artificial light at night and warmer temperatures from the urban heat island affected plants. And they found that artificial light at night showed greater impact on extending urban growing seasons than temperatures did. Specifically, spring tended to occur 6.4 days sooner in cities, and autumn ended 7.1 days later in cities compared with rural areas. One additional interesting piece of the study was that it found that while temperatures increased in urban areas, it was a more gradual increase. Conversely, artificial lighting grew exponentially toward denser regions of urban areas.
Bill, can I just quickly make a comment, kind of ties these few studies together that you've been mentioning? What I think this is revealing, and this last one really puts an emphasis on this, is how recent the phenomenon of artificial light at night is, even though electric lighting has been around for 150 years or so, against the backdrop of evolution acting over a long period of time. It is so recent that a lot of biological systems have not had nearly enough time to adapt to this. And in places where light pollution is coming up for the first time, where cities are, places are becoming electrified, cities are being lit, that happens literally in the blink of an eye from an evolutionary perspective. And the fact that we're almost every time we do another one of these studies, it turns up a novel effect. It turns up something that maybe we weren't even expecting, like the situation with the trees. And when you think through it, it makes sense as to why, the trees are being fooled into believing that it's still towards summer. They're keeping their leaves on, and then they're at a real disadvantage when the first frost comes or a heavy snowfall, and they're not ready for it. And we are perturbing these natural systems with artificial light at night in ways that there are few other consequences of human activity, I think, that can have such a rapid onset and can really push these natural and especially biological systems out of equilibrium. And they just cannot react fast enough. And then I think about that in consideration of all the other pressures that biological systems are under from climate change and loss of biodiversity and habitat and all of that, natural systems are really stressed out right now. And of all the things that it would be easiest for us to dial back, I've got to believe that artificial light at night is way up there on that list.
John, it would be so easy to make this a world where you can have your light and you can have your darkness. You can do both at the same time. I always say light pollution is a have your cake and eat it kind of fix, because really what you're talking about is having good lighting in an area that targets the area where you need to have the lighting, and then just don't light up the side of a tree like we do here in Philadelphia with our streetlights. It's not that hard.
Right. If the reason we put light out there into the world at night, artificial light, is for the benefit of humans, that's what we represent, the purpose of artificial light is. To me, it makes logical sense. Cater very specifically to the human need, right? If we did that, we would eliminate a lot of the waste right away, and it would have the effect of reducing these pressures on these biological systems tremendously.
And I just want to add here, I mean, there's also, again, some not so obvious consequences that science is pointing to. Like if we do extend, the season for these plants, for example, there's studies showing that allergies for us humans are going to increase or extend, right? So again, if we're thinking about, as you pointed out, thinking about ourselves, the impact on humans, there's a lot we can point to if that's where the value lies. But yeah, I found these studies interesting. And again, connecting the dots here between, we have these inner clocks. All life has these inner clocks, and they're not just 24-hour clocks, but they also tell us, inform the body of the seasons. So when we are getting miscues from the environment, that throws everything off, and we're not able to prepare for those changing seasons. And that includes us.
Yeah. Well said. Well said, everyone. We have a study. Let's get into the biology stuff. Let's get into the human side of things. How about that, Lynn?
All right. If you insist.
It took a while to get there, but we're finally here. We have a study from environmental pollution, which looked at 8,000 individuals between 35 to 70 in Yazd province in Iran, and looked at see how they slept. They assessed a generalized light pollution level via satellite data and surveyed the participants about their sleep. Depending on one's location in Yazd province, the sky brightness can swing quite wildly. The researchers correlated sky brightness with shorter sleep duration and higher use of sleep medications, though these folks, maybe from lack of sleep, had less trouble falling asleep. It should be noted that this study, like many of the satellite-based papers, are unable to assign causation to their findings. Lynn, I'm curious about the studies that you came across in your book, because a lot of these, I would say that a good chunk of these studies that I come across each month are trying to find correlation, but that's about all they can get to.
Yeah, it's a major challenge in this area of research. The satellite data, that's picking up the light, up above that is being reflected up. And that's not necessarily what people are being exposed to on the ground. And yeah, this is epidemiological. This is, not direct. We're not doing a clinical trial where we have one group exposed to, light and another not, where we control for all these factors. So it's hard, but it is information. And when we combine these studies, which I did see a lot of, and a lot of them, similarly point to less sleep at night. I know there was one that was focused on adolescent kids. This was in the US, finding less sleep where there was more indoor light or light that trespassed indoors or from indoor lighting. And a lot of studies looking at cancer too, which are controversial because of the same thing here. How do we really tease apart all the factors that are at play? But I think studies are doing a fairly good job of controlling for some of these other factors, socioeconomic status and the like, and then pairing that with our greater and greater understanding of the mechanisms, right? We're understanding how the biology is impacted by that light at night, through more and more pathways that we're discovering of how that light could be impacting us. And it's not just circadian rhythm, although it's a huge one, but there's more direct impacts too that we're finding between how the light is suppressing our melatonin or how it's having other, indirect impacts on our bodies. So yeah, again, it's hard to tease out causation from this correlation, but when you look at the big picture, I think a clearer and clearer picture is coming out.
Now, there's a study in biological timing and sleep, and I believe researchers used mice for this one. They wanted to see whether internal clock could be affected by bright light simply by hitting the skin and absorbing into subcutaneous fat tissue. This was a follow-up to a 2017 study that found that blue light could actually change fat cell metabolism, thereby reducing fat storage and altering the hormones of the subjects. The study used mouse tissue samples exposed to white light for 4 hours at various times and then tracked changes in the tissues and found that light exposure did not shift the circadian clock of the mouse. Further, the light appears to enact influence on the fat tissue independent of circadian timing mechanisms. So we're starting to get a little more detailed view of things. John, I see you nodding your head over there.
Yes, and I think we focus a lot on the circadian issues, and Lynne has dug really deeply into this, and I know can provide a lot of commentary on that. What this study in particular, what jumped out to me was that here is an effect that's modulated by light, but doesn't seem to have anything to do directly with clock systems. It's important to note, though, as much as we talk about the circadian rhythm, she mentioned a minute ago in her response to the other study about how there are other rhythms. Some of them are seasonal. Some of them happen on time span that's more or less than 24 hours. There are peripheral clocks throughout the human body that are all looking back at that master clock, but they're running systems that are not necessarily on a 24-hour period, or they may or may not be on a longer period. But if there's something going on with the cellular biology that's not clock dependent and is adding on top of the modifications that we're making to clocks, because certainly in the real world, they might have controlled this in order to ensure that the mice were not circadian shifted as a consequence of the experimental design. But in the real environment, exposure to all this artificial light at night is probably also shifting circadian clocks. So then there are questions like, how does that add up when you start putting those pieces together? And I think it just shows that there's so much we don't understand about this. But at the same time, if you look at the lay of the land across all kinds of studies in humans, in animal models, in small groups, in large cohorts, the compass needle might have been swinging, a lot of different directions 5 or 10 or 15 years ago, but increasingly it's only pointing in one direction. And that's that all this light exposure is ultimately bad for us.
Yeah, I was just going to underscore that point. I mean, whichever pathway it's causing its consequences, there are consequences. And yeah, we're finding that circadian is just a piece of the puzzle. And there's a researcher in Cincinnati, Richard Lang, who's been doing some really fascinating work looking at these different opsins, or those non-visual light pigments that we have all over our body, not just in our eyes, and how they respond. And it's informing not just the clock, but directly impacting metabolism, as this study is kind of hinting at. And that's on top of, again, the direct impact on melatonin, direct impact on alertness that we're finding that light can have. It's really fascinating. I mean, we're really kind of on the threshold here of discovering more and more, and a lot of questions still remain unanswered right now.
Well, there is a study that makes a case for dark bedrooms. From the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism, artificial light at night appears to speeds up puberty. This study looked at 886 children between 6 to 10 years old in Taichung, Anhui province in China. And the children were assessed every 6 months. For each 30-minute post-bedtime increase in the duration of light over 3 lux, there was a 9% increase in early development for boys and 12% increase in early development for girls. On average, boys and girls in light-exposed groups started 4 months earlier than the control. Then, did you see anything similar to that in your research when you were going to make the book?
Yeah, I think this adds to growing literature that suggests it doesn't take much light at night to wreak havoc. Scientists now have come out with consensus about how much light should we be getting during the day, how much light in the evening, how much while we're supposed to be sleeping at night. And they're basing this on a new metric looking at particularly the light that's heavier in blue wavelengths, since we know that impacts our circadian rhythms more. And on that metric, it's 1 lux is what we should be having overnight. So, and it's really, really small amounts of light because we evolved again with darkness at night and maybe just a warm fire, right? Or moonlight. And so anything that falls outside of that is confusing our bodies. And there was a study or a series of studies out of Northwestern University that found just like leaving a hallway light on, for example, in older people, that was enough to elevate overnight heart rate. That was enough to increase the risk of diabetes and other metabolic disorders. And a lot of it, I think, rests on the impact on hormones, which this study is getting at, and impact on metabolism. And these things are interconnected, right? So I think, yeah, even when our eyes are closed, even when we're asleep, we might be thinking we're doing just fine. And again, this subtle effect could be happening that people just may not be even aware of.
When I go into the backcountry, I have the best sleep of my life. Always happens. And I imagine it's partly because when it's dark, I'm going to bed, right? So my body is naturally aligned to the motions of the earth. But then also, I don't have to like wear a light mask or, I don't have to wear an eye mask or anything. There's no artificial approach to how night is, right? So I wanted to ask you, one lux. What is one lux?
Yeah, my recollection, there was a paper out several years ago. Chris Kaiba, Andre Mohar, Thomas Posh, and some others measured it. And they found that the absolute brightest that full moon light ever gets, if you're there at the instant of full moon, because there's this thing called the opposition surge where the shadows on the moon are minimized, and briefly for a few hours, it's elevated. And they found that was about 0.3 of a lux. But that under most circumstances, full moon light is more like 0.2. So a lux is already 4 to 5 times more intense than full moonlight. And my other recollection was that in some people, circadian sensitivity, if the light is of a particular color that really is activating to the circadian system, that some people down at like 0.5, 0.6 lux are already reporting disturbed sleep, and consequences are kind of suggestive that even that low level of light is already messing with their circadian rhythm.
Right. And I think it's an important point there too, is that everybody is really different. There was a study looking at the amount of light that would impact one person's, melatonin versus another. And it's orders of magnitude difference in some cases. So it's really personal as well.
Well, that's good. That helps clarify things. Man, one lux sounds pretty bright. Yeah. Well, here's a study I want to have your folks' opinion on. I'm curious about your thoughts on this. It comes from BMC Public Health out of a research team based in Shanghai. Team attempted to assess if artificial light at night was a correlative factor for childhood weight gain. To partially control for this, they measured the child's daily activity level. This involved 628 children between 9 to 15, and they used light meters next to beds between April through December of 2024. Sounds pretty good. Now, here's where I need your help, because it feels kind of foggy to me here. 72% of participants were exposed to light in excess of 1 lux during sleep, which means 28% were essentially in a dark control group. What they found was that given all the factors being equal, that the 28% dark control group didn't have any statistical difference to the light group to start. However, under continuous and increasing exposure, they found a barely significant relationship. But they list their finding as that that higher light intensity was associated with increased weight gain, adding that every additional hour of the day with exposure over 1 lux drove this weight gain, and claiming that nighttime light exposure increased the odds of weight gain by 27%. John, did you have a chance to look at this study? What are your thoughts on this? Is this good science here?
Well, I will give them a lot of credit, certainly, for making actual measurements of the light intensity in the sleeping rooms. That's what's been missing from comparable studies we talked about earlier that are derived from satellite remote sensing data, to where we make some assumptions. If we measure a certain amount of upward light with the satellite, which is all in the form of mostly outdoor sources, trying to infer something about the intensity of light that people are exposed to in indoor spaces is really difficult. But for a long time, it was hard to measure low intensities of light in interior spaces, the kinds that you would find in sleeping rooms, for example. Increasingly, there are more sensitive devices. Some of them are wearable devices that will clip onto your collar, or you can place by the bedside. So we're getting more accurate and more reliable measurements of actual exposures rather than having to guess what they are. So I'll give them credit right away for that. I think the best I can tell here, and there are things that are not so clear to me, like the spectrum of that light. If they were just measuring the total integrated light, you wouldn't know, is that more or less circadian activating or relevant light? They might be a little too optimistic about the statistics. As you said, 72% of the participants were in a space where the average exposure was above 1 lux. I don't know if it ranged all the way down to 0 for that other 28%. And what about of that 72%? They don't say how many of them, maybe they were exposed to very high levels of light to begin with, vastly in excess of a lux. Without digging into the details, it's hard to know. So I think all of these studies need to be taken with a grain of salt. As Lynn said, some people are more or less sensitive to this light that's otherwise activating to the circadian system. How exactly did they account for that? It just points out the nuance of people in real world settings as clinical research subjects. We just, once again, I hate to fall back on that answer of, well, we need more data, but we do need more data. Studies that are taken like this, but applied to larger groups of people under more diverse real world conditions. Let's do a bunch of those and see how many of these apparent statistically significant relationships still exist.
John, at the end of the year, we had our holiday potluck, which I hope we'll be able to join again for this year at the end of the year. But you had cited an article that had a pretty good hard amount of evidence on how light affected the body. One of the things I've noticed this year is that when you talk to people who are in the industry, they really want to kind of push away anything that isn't hard and concrete, and they want to really cloud any kind of truth around how light may actually be able to impact people. How does one counter some of that when they can easily point to research that may not be clear or may not be, I guess, as rigorous, but it's out there? How does one handle that when dealing with situations where you have people who are going to point out and say, hey, you know what? There's really a lot of noise in the health space. It's not a fully developed space. As far as we know, there's no impact of light on human health.
Quite often I see people who are making those statements are really cherry picking the evidence, and they're really seizing on things that they will play up as being significant deficiencies in design studies, for example, that aren't, and drawing attention to small differences in statistical significance that probably are not as small as they would like you to believe. It's true. There are a lot of studies that are not very well designed. There are a lot of studies that are very well or not very well controlled. But as I mentioned a minute ago, if you look at the lay of the land, if you look at the overall picture of the research and you approach it honestly, it's really hard to construct an argument based on that landscape that there's no effect here, right? I would say that in a controlled laboratory kind of environment, the effect of light on human health and well-being, especially through disruptions to the circadian system, is pretty well established at this point. I'm just not seeing studies that are well designed and report nothing, or that it's good to be exposed to artificial light at night. What I wish they would lean into is this suggestion that there's a right time for the right amount of light. They're not going to sell any less product, right? That's the thing. I don't know why they're pushing back. It makes them, I'm not going to say that there's a direct connection here, but it makes them kind of look like the people who were trying to tell us in the 1960s and 70s that there was no problem with smoking and human health, right? Well, tobacco companies were sitting on the very data that proved how harmful smoking was to human health, right? I'm not saying that they're sitting on comparable data, but you can only push back so hard and for so long before you start to look a little foolish because of the weight of the evidence that's behind it. The data speak for themselves is how I would put it. And I just think we need to do a better job in our communications of being honest about the shortcomings, which I'm super upfront about in the State of the Science report. There's a lot we don't know, but there's a lot we do know with a pretty good degree of confidence. And I think the effect of artificial light at night on human health is one of those things that's known pretty well with a pretty good degree of confidence at this point.
And that's where this book, The Inner Clock, comes in. Lynn, I got a plug in there for you. You like that?
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, John. That was very clear and I think easy for people to digest, because I think that is a really hard spot for a lot of folks listening when they're, if they have to make a case somewhere. It's tough. The health research is not, you can't just pick it up and read it, and it's not something you just pick up and point to. I think you really have to be discerning and have to kind of be immersed in it, like Lynn, like you have been, to be able to convey the story.
I was just going to say, this is probably ignorance on my part. I don't have a lot of depth about understanding of the industry, but why do they have to push back so much where they can still make money by creating more tunable products or, rethinking the wavelengths or engineering? They have so much opportunity here. They can leverage, this science actually perhaps to sell more product or newer products and make people buy newer things. I don't know.
Lynn, the oil industry could have leveraged the ability to create renewables and to take advantage of renewables. And instead they greenwashed and they have a absurdly low percentage of renewables in, energy production. So yeah, why ask why? That's
I'll tell you a story. When I was growing up and go see a doctor, if you had a cold, especially in the winter, one of the things that you were prescribed was artificial sun, and you had to go and get 10 sessions of that. So we had this room with a lamp, where as a kid, that was one of your cures. You had to go and sit and get enough sunlight, and that's what, got you enough vitamin D to get over whatever colds you were carrying. I've never seen anything like this anywhere else, but that was my childhood, So why don't we have that? Are there studies to back that? And maybe if we give people a little bit of that natural sunlight, we will feel better.
Is that comparable to the light boxes or the sun lamps that people have for seasonal affective disorder?
I suppose, yes. I don't remember. Okay. It was just one of those things, vitamin C and vitamin D in the
The seasonal affective disorder lamps, they don't give you vitamin D per se, but they do have the other stimulating, circadian syncing, effects of the light. And there are studies that do show how that can really help a lot of people with a lot of problems, in particular mental health issues during the wintertime. It's interesting. They're ahead of the curve.
That was the Soviet Union.
Well, there you go.
It's because you guys didn't have big pharma, right?
It was one pharma, yes.
Well, I want to leave everyone with a quote this episode. We can finish out here, derived from an article that I came across written by Willow DeFaubal in Atmos. This article was from Peter Thiel's arch nemesis and Antichrist hopeful, Greta Thunberg. Once we start to act, hope is everywhere. So instead of looking for hope, look for action. Then and only then will hope come. So I want to thank my guests. I want to thank Tatsiana Thomson. Thank you so much, John Barentine and Lynne Peeples. Tatsiana, where can people learn more about Brome and what you're doing and everything up there in the Great North?
Just visit us online. Give us a call. We have real people answering the phone. So if you have any questions about birds or bird feeding, just 800-856-5685. There'll be no numbers to dial. There'll be a real person answering your questions. And Brome.com. We're available both in the United States and Canada.
Look at that plug. That's how you do it. Okay.
Thank you.
Lynn, where can folks pick up The Inner Clock, Living in Sync with Our Circadian Rhythms? I'm really looking forward to reading the book here.
Well, thank you. Yeah, you can find the book anywhere you buy your books, in whatever way you like to digest them, Audible or Kindle or whatnot. And you can find, pretty much everything on my website. I link to book sales and such, and that's lynnepeeples.com.
Do you post a lot on social media for journalism or for any of the work you do?
Yeah, so there's some of that on my website, but I'm also fairly active on LinkedIn and Blue Sky and Facebook and Instagram. And I try to do the rounds.
Sounds good. And John, how can people learn more about everything you're into? Give us a spiel.
Sure. darkskyconsulting.com. Everything's on the web nowadays. Lots of resources there. Links to some of the research, the resources that people are asking for lighting, for dark skies and light pollution. And also catch me on social media. I'm on most of the major platforms and would love to interact with people about any of these topics.
Excellent. Well, I want to thank my guests one more time. Of course, I want to thank the biggest thanks to all of you at home. Thank you to listener for staying with us this whole show. As a reminder, the show is listener supported. We rely exclusively on the support of you, the listener. If you like what you hear today, why not support the show? This show was recorded on October 19th. You can learn more about today's show by visiting our website, lightpollutionnews.com. Keep an eye out for us on whatever social media channels you are using, because we're probably there. So thank you once again. I'm your host, Bill McGinney, reminding you to only shine the light where it's needed.